All right, welcome to another Science on the Sound here at the Mass Center Aquarium. Today, we've got a special guest with us to talk about life between the Pacific Northwest tides. And this is Emily Bjornsgard. If you haven't met her yet or heard any of the talks that she's done with us, she is the lead aquarist here at the Mass Center Aquarium. So she's also an avid photographer and tide pooler. Is tide pooler a word? We're gonna
Sure.
make it a word.
Yeah.
So she's got lots of photos of her adventures out on the coast and around Puget Sound. And so she's going to talk about some of the cool animals that she's found, but also where you can potentially find them too. If you've got any questions while we go along, please drop them into the chat and we will save them for the end where we've got a little time for Q&A. But no further ado, because I know she's got lots of pictures. Emily, you can take it away.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Ariel. So yes, like Ariel said, my name is Emily Bjornsgard. I use she, her pronouns. And when I am not here at the Mass Center, taking care of all the animals in the life support system, I am usually found along our coastline somewhere taking pictures. If you want to see any of those pictures or videos, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram at eMarineLife is the username. Emily's Marine Life and Nature Photography is the long title. But yeah, I'm here to share some of the life between the tides that I see. Though, just a note on the title, there are a lot of reference books that are a variation of this title. So if you're ever looking for intertidal marine life reference guides, search something Life Pacific Northwest and Tides, and you'll find some great references. Right. And so the way that I approach this talk is by photos. So as Ariel mentioned, I take a lot of photos. This is just a little screenshot of how I organize my photos. In the first couple of years of really documenting my beach trips, I was organizing animals by phylum, so by their classification. And then I switched in 2021 to organizing by date and location, just so that I would have a running timeline of what the different beaches look like over time. My earliest photos are from 2013 that I really like. We're focusing on animals, and each one of these folders has a lot of storage. This is all on external terabyte hard drive. So that I can bring it with me wherever I go. And as of last month, it has over 300 gigabytes of data with over 45,000 photos and videos. So I am a bit fanatic with not deleting things because you never know when you might need something. And these are just a few examples of the photos that I've been taking. Some of them are fancier than others. Some of them are funny, like the seagull trying to eat the sea star. Some of them document different phenomenon. So the wave picture here is from down on the Oregon coast during one of the extreme high tides or king tides. This was a species of hydroid I'd never seen before, so I wanted to make sure that I documented it in ways that I could identify it later. And this I thought was almost a heart. It was a broken barnacle. So you never know where you might find some awesome things. So when we think about between the tides, what does intertidal really mean? And another thing we want to know is how to read the tide chart. So if you want to go visit the beaches, we're starting to creep into when our Pacific Northwest low tides are during the day, which can be a little bit more accessible than when they are during the night, like during the winter time. So in the spring and summer, we start to see those extreme low tides during the daytime. This is a fake tide chart that I put together, but just to demonstrate how to read a tide chart. There are lots of different versions. They can be found online. You can also visit stores along the coast and you can find paper tide charts for certain locations. Though you do want to make sure that it is location specific to where you want to be, just because the tide changes time of day based on where you are. So on this very, very simplified tide chart, we're looking at day one. Here in the Pacific Northwest, most of the time we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day, but not all high and low tides are created equally. Typically, we have one high or extreme high tide, followed by a high low. So this is going to be a low tide compared to the high tide, but it will not be necessarily an extreme low tide. And then that will turn into a low high, so a little bit lower than the last high tide, and then followed by a low tide, which then goes back into a high tide. And this is what you will see if you search tide charts for whatever location you're looking for. You might see a wave pattern like this, or you might see a chart that looks something like this, where it has the times of the high and low tides followed by the height. So if you have a number, it's either going to be in feet or inches or maybe even centimeters, depending on where you're looking at your tide chart. And you are going to have some negative numbers in there. And those negative numbers are going to be any tide, so any low tide that is lower than the average low tide. So 0 feet in this case is the average low predicted tide. So you can see that like this high low and this high low are above 0, and then these ones are below 0. So all of the low tides will average out to this 0 foot prediction. And tide charts are always predictions. They are not necessarily accurate because, or not necessarily specific. Weather and different things can change what the actual tide ends up being. Wind and storms can adjust that the day of, but these are the predictions, so we know kind of what it's going to look like when we get to the beach. When I'm going tide pooling, I want to make sure that the tide is as low as possible. So if I have the opportunity to go at any point during this day 1, I will head to the beach about an hour before the lowest low tide, and then stay out there about an hour after. So I hit right when that low water mark is on the beach, and so that I can see as much as possible. And on a lot of our beaches, we have a pretty extreme vertical water movement during the tides. Seal Rock State Park is down on the Central Oregon coast. I used to live in this area for a couple of years, so I was a frequent visitor to this beach and documented it quite a bit. There's about a 14-foot vertical intertidal zone, depending on the season and depending on the extreme nature of the tides. So on an extreme high tide, the tide may be 12, 13 feet, and an extreme low tide might be -1, -2, maybe even -3 feet. And so on an extreme high tide, this entire beach is underwater. You can see this photo on the left was taken during a high tide, and that is this rock here. So you can see the water is splashing almost all the way up that rock. You can imagine, you can see people in this photo. They would be very much underwater at a high tide. This was a pretty standard low tide. I believe it was like a -1.5, maybe a -2. So definitely lots of beach exposed, but not quite as far out as it can go on those really extreme tides. And then I want you to remember this rock structure right here, because as we move on to the next slide, this is another example of king tides. That is the same rock structure at a very extreme high king tide. And king tides, they're a natural phenomenon, and they are those extreme high tides. Typically, we label them king tides in the winter when they are often exacerbated by storms. So we'll get really high tides with our really low tides being in the middle of the night. So we won't necessarily see the low tides. We will see the high tides. They're in the middle of the day. They create these great sprays of waves along the coast, and they are awesome for photography, but also very dangerous to be on the beach. So when you hear king tides, it's not a scary thing. It is a natural process that happens. And the king tides, because they are an extreme high tide, do correspond with extreme low tides, but they are not on the same time. They'll be on the same days. And then when we talk about the intertidal zone, we're talking from the highest high tide to the lowest low tide, anything that might be exposed on a low tide exploration trip. And all of those layers we see in between are called zonation. So all the animals that live in the intertidal zone have adapted to very specific conditions. If an animal is able to exploit one area the best, it will be able to live in that area and crowd out other species. So you can see in this photo, this was down in Yachats, just south of Seal Rock, that there is really extreme zonation here along this channel of the coast. So we've got our high intertidal here at the top, really, really small barnacles, really small snails, sometimes some small algae. Not a lot grows up here because it is one of the more harsh zones. It has to tolerate both saltwater, but also a lack of saltwater for long periods of time during low tides. It has to tolerate freshwater and storms and wind and rain. So there are a lot of species that live up here, but they tend to be really small. And not as populated as some of the lower zones. The mid-intertidal on the Oregon coast and out on our Washington coast is typically dominated by California mussels, sometimes also blue mussels and gooseneck barnacles. You have these really thick mussel beds. There are a ton of animals that live in these mussel beds. And the bottom of the mid-intertidal typically corresponds with where the mussel bed stops. I feel like is a generally accepted term. It is, and where the mussel bed stops is often where the sea stars start. So sea stars, especially ochre stars, are one of the main predators of the California mussels. They will crawl up the rock to eat the California mussels, but they are also not super able to withstand being out of the water for long periods of time. And so they will crawl as high as they can go. You can see there's an orange sea star here. There's also a few more along this stretch of rock, but this is as high as they will go. So this is the start of the low intertidal zone. And you can see this is all pink. Coralline algae is a species of algae that can be found both on the outer coast and in the Salish Sea and the inland sea here in Washington and British Columbia. And that is a good indication here of the low tide. And then anything below the waterline on a low tide is subtidal, below the tides, and is not typically exposed. Here in the Pacific Northwest, I like to classify beaches personally for me by the amount of wave action and then the amount of solid structure. And it kind of, our beaches, there's definitely some in between here, but for the most part, they fall into these different categories. We've got our sandy beaches that are relatively low rock structure, got a lot of sand and a lot of movement. And the high wave action, that's going to be on our outer coast, our Westport, Long Beach, Ocean Shores, kind of that area, then down into Oregon as well. On the other end, we have our sandy beaches, but that have low wave action or that are more sheltered shorelines. That's going to be within the Salish Sea or within other estuaries and bays. This picture is from Birch Bay, but you'll get a lot of eelgrass beds, sand dollar beds, kelp beds that are in a little bit less wave action. There's more protection from that big turnover that would cause problems for some eelgrass and some macroalgae growth on the outer coast. And then when you move into our solid rock structure, you have some areas with lower wave action, not necessarily low, but lower. If you go out to Fort Eby State Park, a lot of the rocks are boulder sized or river rock sized. So there is some disruption. It's not all one solid structure. So things get moved around in the waves, but you do have a lot of kelp. There's tons of animals that are constantly rearranging because the beach is constantly changing. And then out on the outer coast, both on the northern Washington coast and then along the Oregon coast, where you have the rocky headlands, we've got high wave action, and you also have really solid structures that don't tend to change very much year to year. And so you are able to have really big buildups of the mussel clumps and lots of different types of algae. These typically have the most disruption from sand scouring the beach seasonally, but the rocky structures themselves don't really move. And so if we're looking what are we going to find on these different types of beaches? This picture is from Westport. These photos are from Westport and Waldport, I believe, in Oregon. The craziest thing I've ever seen washed up on the beach was a coconut that was completely encased in its shell, washed up in the waves, and it was not edible at that point, but it was on the beach in Westport, not a native thing. So it definitely had to travel to get there. These sandy shores on the outer coast is also where you're going to find razor clams, which is a huge recreational and commercial industry along our Pacific Northwest coast. One of my favorite crustaceans there is in my hand. Those are mole crabs. And they typically are found more on the Oregon coast rather than the Washington coast. You can find them in Washington, but they tend to be more stable populations in Oregon. They don't have really like pinchers that are going to hurt. They just kind of burrow into the sand and live in that ever moving swash zone of the waves and are filter feeding. Of course, you've got your harbor seals and other pinnipeds that will haul up onto the beaches. And then you have a lot of birds. This is one of my favorite pictures of great blue herons that I've seen before. This was down in Waldport. But even though the beach looks relatively empty, there is a lot of animals that either utilize the beach or live there, and we just may not see them. And then our sheltered sandy sea, Salish Sea beaches. Two pictures I have here are Birch Bay State Park up by Bellingham, and then Freshwater Bay is kind of an inlet out along the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The point out at Freshwater Bay is very rocky and has a lot of those exposed or semi-exposed animals that live in higher wave action, but inside the bay itself, you get eelgrass beds and you get some of those more protected species as far as beaches go. Again, lots of birds, lots of burrowing anemones. So this here in the middle is a moonglow anemone that you can tell by its long skinny tentacles and the striping on the feeding tentacles there. You'll get a lot of jellies that will come in seasonally. This is a baby starry flounder. So again, lots of animals use these spaces, but they aren't necessarily seen all the time. So you kind of there's different techniques to find animals on these sandy beaches where there's not a lot of hiding places. A lot of them, like these flounders, hide in plain sight. And then moving on to rocky shores. So these are going to be our vertical structures. A lot of these are found on a lot of these examples are from the Oregon coast, but we have plenty of these in on the outer Washington coast and then up around the San Juan Islands and British Columbia. This is where you're going to find those really big mussel beds and really large sea stars. A lot of animals will get a little bit bigger in these areas because there is so much more structure to attach to and stay attached to. There's a little bit less disruption, even though there is a lot of wave action. These are some of my favorite beaches to visit because they're always changing, but there's always a lot of life to see. And when you get into the really low intertidal zone, like here or here, these green anemones can get quite large, up to, I want to say 8 to 10 inches across, maybe even a little bit bigger. And then the ochre stars here also come in a really wide variety of colors. And then maybe my second favorite type of beach to go explore are our gravelly, bouldery beaches here in the Salish Sea. This is for EB State Park. If you move down the beach, you will see more and more animals typically, but you will sometimes see things washed up in the sandy, gravelly part. Some of these photos are also from Bellingham. So these were some spaghetti worms that were underneath a rock. When you are tide pooling or exploring these shores, you want to be really careful, not only to keep yourself safe, but also to keep the animals safe. If you do overturn a rock, make sure it's one that you are capable of lifting without hurting yourself, and that you are capable of setting back down in the same position without hurting any of the animals that might be underneath. And then another great place to look for animals are on man-made structures. So dock fouling has, I think, been seeing a rise in popularity recently, at least in the tide pooling groups that I've been in. There are a ton of animals that will move into man-made structures, and you can always, and there's a lot of things to find. It will also tell you that this area is a really healthy area, because if there's no animals, then you could have indications of problems. This photo on the left here is from San Juan Islands, but then this one is from Poulsbo over in Kitsap County. Some of these are from Newport. Docks can be really productive areas for animals because they can be a little bit more protected. So this picture in Poulsbo, the Shiner perch would come in every summer to have their babies, and it was an area where they were protected from some predators that they would have maybe experienced in other areas. And this is also a really good place to look if it's not a low tide, because especially if it's a floating dock, because the animals are always there. Technically, this area here is always subtidal, even if it's a high tide or a low tide, because it never comes out of the water. So you might see different animals dock fouling that you wouldn't necessarily see tide pooling. So moving on to just the marine life that you might be seeing, we'll go through these, just kind of touching on some of the pictures that I find particularly fun. As far as plants go in our intertidal zone, there are plants in our intertidal zone, particularly in the saltwater itself. We've got our surf grass here and our eelgrass here. Eelgrass will live in sand. It has a structure called a rhizome that connects all of the leaves and the roots together, and will dig down into the sand and hold on that way. It's found in more sheltered areas, whereas surfgrass is a narrower leaf and actually attaches to rocks rather than sand. So its roots attach to rock and sometimes are then covered in sand, but are not living solely in sand. This is a flowering, fruiting body of the eelgrass. So it doesn't look like a flower, but it is. And these are marine plants that are capable of their entire life cycle in saltwater, which is not necessarily the case for most plants. So they're very specially adapted to living in their environment. And then we have three main types of macroalgae that we see on our coastline. Macroalgae is our non-microscopic seaweeds. They are not plants, even if they do photosynthesize. Algae is in a whole different classification than plants. So it is very, very different. It's also quite a bit older, where it branches off from plants. But it's got a huge diversity. There's several hundred species of algae along our coastlines here, from our brown algae. So our sea palm here is a really interesting algae that lives really only in high wave areas. So it's got this really thick hold fast structure that attaches their stipes and their little blades. And they look just like little palm trees out on the coast, just flowing in the surf. We have our fucus. This is fucus or rockweed. This is one of the most common intertidal algae in the entire area. When they are reproductively active, these bulbs, forked bulbs on the end, puff up, and that part is actually edible. I've heard that tastes like Cheeto Puffs, though I've never tried it. So if you ever try that, get back to me and let me know. We've got Turkish towel here, which is this red, rough looking, bladed algae. And this actually is a source of a compound called carrageenan, which is a thickening product that can be used in ice cream. It can be used in cosmetics. It's really important to a lot of our different industries. One other shout out, this is Codium fragile, or sea staghorn. It's a really interesting green algae that doesn't look anything like an algae. It feels more like a sponge. And it is home to a couple sea slug species that will live almost specifically on this algae and feed on it as well. Sponge is found along our coast. We typically see a lot of encrusting sponges, which is what all of these four are. And they're typically named by color. So we've got our red, we've got purple, we've got yellow breadcrumb and yellow green encrusting sponge. This, I believe, is a small piece of finger sponge, which is typically a subtidal species. This was a really extra low tide that I went out and saw, photographed this one. So jury's still out. Sponge is really hard to identify to the species level, even for experts. So it's always kind of a do your best, take as many photos as you can. but they are home to a lot of, or they are the food of a lot of animals. So like this sea slug, if you were looking out for sea slugs, you want to find the sponge that those might be eating, and you're going to have a much better chance of finding the sea slug that you're looking for. Cnidarians is a group that includes a lot of different types of organisms. Jellies, anemones, sea pens, corals, hydrocorals are all in this group. We also have our stalked jellies, which are a fascinating species that I could talk forever on. But a lot of times if we're dock fouling, we'll see jellies along the docks. Lion's mane jellies wash up and are quite large. That's my boot print. It's a size 10 in women, so you can see that this was quite a large jelly. They get about double that size, but that was a good sized individual. The speckles in this egg yolk jelly are actually parasitic amphipods. And so sometimes you can find surprise animals when you go back and look through photos. This is a soft coral, an aggregating soft coral here, the pink blobs that you can find intertidally. And then this is a cup coral, also can be found intertidally on really low tides. This one I found up at Salt Creek Recreation Area in Tongue Point on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. We've got a variety of anemones that can be found intertidally, green surf anemones and pink-tipped aggregating anemones are very closely related, as well as the moonglow anemone here. And these they don't always, but they can host symbiotic algae, just like a coral would. So symbiotic microalgae that gives them this really bright green color. And then if you're dock fouling, you might see these plumose anemones that look a lot different. They have a lot thinner tentacles than, say, the green surf anemone, but that's because they're eating smaller things. So plumose anemones are filter feeders. They're going to be eating copepods and little tiny microscopic things in the water, whereas green anemones will eat anything they can catch. Sometimes that's catching mussels, sometimes that's catching crabs, all sorts of different things. And there are a lot of different ways that anemones will reproduce. Some of these you can see in the intertidal zone. This one here on the left is splitting. So the pink-tipped aggregating anemones aggregate because they split in half through fission. And so this one was almost ready to split. And in this way, they can cover large areas of rock in very short periods of time. Like I said before, space is really important in the intertidal zone. So this is one way that they can take advantage of that. Brooding anemones, like this one, will grow little baby anemones along its skirt or along its body column, and then they will eventually crawl away and become their own individual. And then they can also sexually reproduce. So these were two anemones that I found right next to each other up at Salt Creek a couple years ago. This is a male that's releasing sperm, and this is a female that was releasing eggs. So tons of different ways to reproduce. These are just a couple of them that I've seen intertidally before. Ctenophores are a very ancient species. There's a variety of ones that we see intertidally here. Often we see them washed up on the beach, like the sea gooseberry, or if we're in shallow water, we might see them. There's my boot. See them floating along, or you might also see them dock fouling. They do not have stinging cells like cnidarians do, but they catch things with mucus and sometimes with trailing tentacles. There's so many different types of worms that it could also be its own talk, but these are just a few that you might see intertidally. This is the feeding tentacles of a calcareous tube worm. So these form a really hard shell-like tube that is currently under this rock ledge. We've got scale worms like this one here that lives independently, or we have them that live on other species. This is a scale worm that lives on sea stars specifically. And then we've got our spaghetti worms, which are really important detritivores in intertidal ecosystems. So they're taking in decaying materials or leftover food from other animals and converting it back into the ecosystem. This is an orange ribbon worm, which looks a little scary, but just tend to leave them alone. And then again, dock fouling, you see a lot of feather duster worms. These are Vancouver feather duster worms. They can be found dock fouling or on semi-exposed coasts in really big clumps. Their tubes are more paper-like than the shells of the other tube worms. Mollusks, these might be getting more into the more popular species. Of course, mollusks include squid. This was a baby squid that I saw dock fouling one day. The California mussels are a mollusk, so they are really a foundational important species for ecosystem building. We've got snails in this group and limpets. Rib limpets you will see relatively high in the intertidal zone. So they are one of those species that are capable of tolerating a variety of different habitat or different conditions. Chitons are have shell plates rather than one shell. So they've got 8 shell plates. Sometimes you can't see them, like on a gumboot chiton. Their shell plates are internal under this kind of leathery shell or leathery covering. And of course, our sea slugs, our nudibranchs are in this group, and our octopus. Moon snails are a species that I think surprise a lot of people if they come to a sandy beach. This is one of those that is often out of sight, but not that far away. Moon snails are a carnivorous, very large snail. The shells can get several inches across. These two here were about, I would say, 4 or 5 inches across with the shell, but their foot here, their body will expand beyond that. They are capable of fitting all the way into their shell, but their body may be like twice the diameter of their shell itself. They are carnivorous, so they eat clams, and they have the ability to drill into a clam. This looks like it was a unsuccessful attempt here. It did not get all the way through the shell. This one was successful, where it drilled into the clam and was able to slurp out the meat inside. And then if you ever see anything that looks kind of like a plunger, like a sandy plunger on the beach, especially in the springtime coming up in the next couple months, please don't throw it away. These are the egg cases of moon snails, and they contain many thousands of eggs. And so each of these will create or hatch into thousands of baby moon snails. So we want to make sure those stay on the beach, even though they look like garbage. And then one question that I get all the time is, how do I find sea slugs? And the answer to that is really big, because there are so many different types of sea slugs here in the Pacific Northwest. Like I said before, one of my biggest pieces of advice is follow their food, because often the food is easier to see than the sea slug itself. I also recommend looking during the spring and summertime. Maybe even late summer is when you're really going to start to see them. Here in the aquarium at the Mass Center, we start to see different species throughout the summer, and then we'll see them come into the tanks as larvae, grow, lay eggs, and then they disappear for the year. So it's really interesting to kind of see that pattern going through. But yeah, follow their food. So like with dorids, these are the traditional slug-shaped sea slugs. This is a clown dorid. These are sea lemons. This is a red sponge dorid and some leopard dorids. A lot of dorids eat encrusting things. So the leopard dorid and yellow sea lemon eat sponge. So sponge is a great place to look for them. You can also look for their egg ribbons, which is right here. This clown dorid is laying an egg ribbon, and those are a good ways to see the sea slugs, or to look for the sea slugs, know you're in a good place. Some sea slugs will use the water as transport. So this one is actually upside down on the surface tension of the water. So you want to walk really slowly, see if you can find them. This one is a rainbow dendronatid, or I want to say iridescent also. They are quite large when they're adults, but this one was only a couple inches, and they will free swim. So if you're dock fouling, you may see it wiggling back and forth, and that is a sea slug trying to move from place to place. And then shaggy mouse nudibranchs are very fluffy like this, and their favorite food is anemones. So these pink-tipped aggregating anemones, or also plumose anemones, these really prefer to chew on. So if you're looking for this species, look around the anemones. And then also, how do I find an octopus is also a question that I get quite often. There are two main octopus species you're going to see here in Oregon, Washington, and California, or Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. If you go south into California, I believe there's a couple more species that can be found intertidally. Both of these species aren't super common intertidally, but they are sometimes found. And I'm talking about the Pacific red octopus and the giant Pacific octopus. I have found Pacific red octopuses a couple times on the beach. This one I didn't find, but I came upon someone who had found it. And it had likely been dropped by a bird. You can see that several of its arms are damaged, and it had been sitting there for quite a bit. I used a shell to gently move it into the water. Even though it wasn't in super good condition, I wanted to see if maybe it would perk up. And sure enough, it did. It zoomed off as soon as it was in the water. So that was a happy ending. Generally, I don't recommend moving marine life, and especially with octopus, because they are capable of biting. Definitely don't move by hand. But if you feel comfortable and you feel like you've had enough training to do so, then to each their own. Over here on the left was a Pacific red octopus I found actually just down the beach from the Mass Center. Someone had left a rock turned upside down, which can be detrimental to the animals that were living on that rock. So when I flipped it right side up, there happened to be an octopus under it. And because this octopus was in water and was moving well, I just kind of let it be. These are screenshots from a video I took of it slowly flipping itself over and making its way back under the correctly oriented rock. So in a lot of cases, you just let them be. You don't want to touch them if you don't have to, but just let them find you. And then this giant Pacific octopus is the only one that I've ever seen alive in the intertidal zone. I have stumbled across deceased octopus before, but this one just happened to be chilling in a tide pool, didn't have to move any rocks or anything. I was actually looking at a fish in the nearby tide pool and then happened to look over and there was an octopus right there. This was a relatively small giant Pacific octopus. That's my finger. So only a couple inches across, but it was a very exciting day. And this was up at Salt Creek, so you never really know where they're going to show up, but you always want to be prepared, but moving very gently through any beach areas. Arthropods is a huge group. I want to say over half of animals on Earth are arthropods. Not all are marine arthropods, but it's a gigantic group with a ton of diversity. This includes our crabs and shrimp and hermit crabs and isopods, and our barnacles. So a few on here. We've got our amphipod and isopod species over on this top corner. These are typically quite small, usually a couple inches, though the sea slaters, which are these big flat isopods shaped arthropods, are quite big. I think the biggest one I've ever seen was a couple inches long. Gooseneck barnacles are typically found in higher wave action. Giant barnacles are really low intertidal species, though you can see them out of water on really low tides. A couple different types of shrimp that can be found. These are sand shrimp, genus Krangan. They're typically on sandy beaches like eelgrass beaches, or even sometimes on more exposed outer coast beaches. We've got hermit crabs that cosplay as snails. So sometimes when you flip a snail shell over, or if you see a snail shell flipped over, you will see legs coming out instead of the foot of a snail. That's going to be your hermit crabs. We've got some of our crab species. We've got shore crabs up here in the corner. This, I believe, was a granular claw crab. But again, not a super great photo, but enough that I was able to look it up later. Dungeness crab can be found intertidally, as well as subtidally, and are a really important commercial catch. And then kelp crabs are very feisty. Any crab or creature with pinchers, you want to, if you're handling it, handle it carefully. There is a range of pinching abilities that you see here, but in general, treat them all with respect. Here at the top, this is one of my favorite crab species. This is a decorator crab. And this one actually fooled my iPhone. I took this picture of this decorator crab and it came up with automatically identifying it as a plant. So they are one of nature's very good camouflagers. Arthropods molt, that is one of their main identifications. So a lot of times when you're on the shoreline, you will see the molts or the exoskeletons of these creatures on the beach. That doesn't mean the animal was dead. So if you see a whole bunch of these, it doesn't mean you have a big die-off on your hands. It means that these animals are growing. And you can see here, even the gill covers are left behind. So they leave behind pretty much everything but their eyeballs. And they are empty and they don't smell. So if you have a crab shell, even if it's closed, if it doesn't smell, it's likely a molt and not a dead crab. Echinoderms are a really fascinating group. Fairly closely, as far as invertebrates go, fairly closely related to vertebrates. We've got our sea stars, sun stars, baby sea stars, urchins, sea cucumber, another sea cucumber, sand dollars, and brittle stars. And they are all in the echinoderm group, which means spiny skinned. So whether that's an internal microscopic spine or a very visible external spine, that's what connects all these animals is their spiny skin. Echinoderms typically are found in the low intertidal or lower. Very rarely do they venture up higher than low tide. Ochre stars really prefer California mussels and shelled organisms. Leather stars eat anemones and other soft-bodied organisms. So there is a wide range of diets in here. This was one of my more recent finds, very, very exciting, a baby sunflower star out at Salt Creek. I thought at first that it might be wasting or having some sort of issue, but I did check with researchers, sent it into UC Santa Cruz's database, and they said it was doing probably okay. Didn't look like it was wasting, just growing arms, which was a really exciting find. Though sea star wasting is a problem and continues to be an issue along our coastline. This was a trip down to Seal Rock a couple years ago, but it really, I thought, demonstrates the range of symptoms that we can see from sea star wasting. For those of you who aren't familiar with sea star wasting, it is a suite of symptoms that sea stars can exhibit. We don't know exactly what the cause is, or if there are multiple causes at this point. We know that temperature spikes can trigger it, and there are some proposed treatments being developed in a variety of aquariums. So there's definitely a lot of research going into this, but this has been occurring since 2013 along our coastlines. And so if you see a sea star with a missing arm or very deflated or a little lesion or twisted arms, extra twisted arms, shall we say, that can be a sign that there is something going on that beach. All of these photos were from May 15th, 2021. This was a healthy ochre star by all accounts. This would be a level 1, very relatively healthy, but it does have a lesion. And then these are some more extreme photos of sea star wasting. Tunicates are our closest not fully vertebrate organisms. As a larva, they do have a almost developed notochord, so an almost spinal cord, and then they almost seem to revert into just this filter feeding blob. Some of them are solitary, like this red shiny sea squirt that's slightly deflated, this bristly tunicate, and then some of them are compound species, so they're colonial, like this one here or this one here. Tunicates are also called ascidians or sea squirts, and they are filter feeders that we can find on our coastlines. And then, of course, we have a variety of fish that can be found here in the intertidal zone and shortly or slightly lower. This was from a research trip that I got to be a part of. This is a buffalo sculpin. I don't recommend handling them. Like I said, this was on a research trip, but you can see they're quite large spines that can be painful if you're not careful with them. Sometimes fish are found out of water. This was a sculpin that was tucked up a couple feet above the low tide line. Sculpin and some of our long, skinny pricklebacks and gunnel species, as well as our clingfish, are capable of living out of water for periods of time when the tide goes out and then as the water comes back in. So it's best with a lot of these fish to leave them where they are. We can cause more problems trying to move them, trying to save them if we try to help them, because they are adapted to this intertidal zone, always changing. There's also a lot of eggs that you can find intertidally, especially as the spring and summer show up. These are sculpin eggs here. In other photos, I've zoomed in and there were actually developing little fish in there. And then this is a plainfin midshipman fish. The males come in intertidally, find a rock to build a nest under, and then the females come and lay eggs, which are all of these little yellow orbs. And then the males guard the eggs until the eggs hatch and swim off. So if you've come across this in the intertidal zone, beware that there is a fish somewhere in that tide pool. It may only be a couple inches deep. So these fish are very, very good at protecting their area. And don't try to save it. It is doing his job, trying to save it, protect his eggs. This photo up here was a very cute little sailfin sculpin that I happened to see intertidally and put into a container in order to photograph it. Lots of birds, shorebirds, seabirds, some duck relatives as well. Baby seagulls look nothing like an adult. They've got little spots and look kind of like a dinosaur. I find them absolutely hilarious. We've got some of our shorebirds, so our pigeon guillemots, both on the outer coast and here, even here at Redondo, we sometimes see pigeon guillemots with their bright orange feet. Rhinoceros auklets up here. I don't tend to see them super close to shore, but I have seen them here off of our mast pier in Redondo. We've got pelicans. These were from the outer coast. If you're down along or anywhere on the outer coast, you will often see seabird colonies in the summertime. So this is the common murres at a colony. These are some cormorants. And then, of course, great blue herons hunting all over the place. And then marine mammals, of course, we want to make sure that we give them all of the space that they are entitled to. It is the law to give them their own space. Some of these photos were taken from shore, like this orca photo. I was up at Fort Eby. They happened to pass by, so I was able to get some great photos of them. Harbor porpoises are quite common throughout the Puget Sound, Salish Sea, our coastline. However, they are rarely seen compared to some of these other species, because this is about as much as you're ever going to see of them. When they're traveling by or they're fishing, they're not typically breaching a whole lot. They'll just pop their little dorsal fin, take a breath, and go back down. Harbor seals are definitely one that you'll likely see along our coastline, especially in the spring and summer, as we start having babies, pupping season. And with them, we definitely want to make sure we give them lots of room. These two photos I took down in Waldport from up above a bridge, or on a bridge up above a sandbar. So they were very much separated, but we got some great photos. And then this photo is some sea lions and then some elephant seals. This was down in Bandon, I believe, Cape Arago, I think, and down southern Oregon coast. And it was the first time I saw elephant seals in person. So that was pretty cool. Last thing I will leave everyone with is beach safety. We always want to be extra careful, whether that's on a sandy beach or a rocky beach, when possible, which it's not always possible if you're exploring the low intertidal zone and space is a prime commodity. Try not to step on species, whether that's kelp or others, because we don't want to hurt ourselves. This is my ankle deep in kelp. You never know what's underneath there. So if you don't know where you're stepping, you want to either step really slowly or work your way out of that position. Here in this middle photo is some quite long surf grass covering a tide pool that, when I checked, was about 4 feet deep. So even if it looks like it's shallow from the top, you never know unless you check. So you always want to be extra careful where you step, especially in the midsummer when we have our really, really good low tides, is when kelp is also really, really growing. So it's always best to just be extra careful, take your time, enjoy the beach. This is my hand with some barnacle scrapes, so barnacle bites, as we like to call them. And then final thing on sandy beaches, you think, oh, nothing can hurt me out here. If you see driftwood piled up like this, you want to be extra careful because beach logs are not super stable. They are up there because the waves were able to push them up there, but that doesn't mean they were put in place where they won't move. So always, if you can help it, try not to step on the driftwood so that you don't accidentally turn your ankle. You want to be careful. But I always recommend just enjoying the intertidal zone. It's a beautiful place. It's a wonderful way to get in touch with your local marine life. There are so many different species that could be found out there, and there's just so much to learn. So with that, any questions?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing all of your experiences with tide pooling and the photos that you've taken while you're out there tide pooling. We do have some questions that have come in. So first one we'll start off with is, where do you like to go tide pooling on the Washington coast and or the Strait of Juan de Fuca?
So I would say my two favorite spots on the Washington coast currently are Fort Eby State Park on Whidbey Island, which is the westernmost point. So it's right where the strait hits the islands. So you get a good mix of species there. And also, I mean, anywhere along the Strait of Juan de Fuca is great. Freshwater Bay is awesome. Salt Creek is really great. There's a lot of different places to access the beach at Salt Creek. There's some sandy entrances and then also some rocky entrances. So there's a lot of ways to get down there. It's not just clambering over rocks. So it's a great one. And then, I mean, any structure is going to have some marine life on it. So if you find structure on a beach, check it
out. Where would you go duck fouling?
So definitely you want to find public docks. That is the biggest thing. You want to make sure that you're in a space where you're allowed to be. But anywhere you have a relatively clean marina, I've found lots of organisms in Poulsbo because I used to live over there. It was a great place. But yeah, any marina that is relatively clean and has public docks, you never know what you're going to find. So
nice. One of the questions that also came in was, does the flowering happen under or above the water? And so I'm assuming that's talking about our aquatic plants that are going to flower. So how do they blossom?
So it like you saw, it's not really a flower, but it does happen in the water because they're in the intertidal zone and typically in the low intertidal zone. It might be exposed to air, but it's typically in the water because that water is going up and down every day. So it's not just a one day thing. So it will happen in the water.
Okay, so like plants on land, so our flowers in our garden are usually pollinated by wind or by animals. These flowers are pollinated more like with water movement and currents.
Yep. So the pollen is adapted to withstand the tidal movements and the wave movements, and so it is able to find a spot in the intertidal zone through water movement.
Very adaptive of that plant. So you had a jelly that had the speckles in it that weren't sparkles, but instead parasites. Can you remove the parasitic arthropods from the jellyfish without damaging it?
Yes. So in the wild, typically you just let them be. But if you're in an aquarium, so like here at the Mass Center, we collected moon jellies for our display last year. And we did find some parasitic amphipods, and you are able to use tweezers to pick them out very gently. And jellies are really great at healing themselves. So they are able to fix that little hole that the amphipod was living in quite easily. So in display, yes, you are able to remove them. In the wild, there's not really a point because it is part of the ecosystem, and they don't typically kill the jelly, but they are can cause problems in an aquarium system.
So to get away from gross parasites, question is why go out an hour before low tide and not right at low tide?
So you can go out to the beach whenever, but if you want to experience the low tide, I personally prefer to go out beforehand so that I have more time to explore the beach. If you go out right at low tide, the tide starts to creep up as you're out there, so you'll have less time at that lowest point. If you go out an hour before, you could follow the water out to that lowest point, explore it, and then follow it back in. So if you've got 2 hours to explore, you want to go an hour beforehand and then stay an hour after.
So for people who are coming to the Puget Sound, don't have to deal with tides because they're inlanders. How fast does the tide like change? And how much time do you have realistically on the beach for safety wise before you've got to start, getting back up to land?
So it really depends on the beach, and on how low that tide is. If you're on, say, if you're in the Puget Sound, if you've got a relatively clear path back up the beach, so say you're on an eelgrass bed and it's just sand, you can watch the water come back in, but you don't have to just rush off the beach. So you'll slowly and slowly see less, but you can spend as much time as you want to out there. Eventually you'll just run out of beach. But if you're on the outer coasts, say like where this picture was taken, this was down in Yachats, in Oregon, where it's a lot of rocky structures and there's a lot of dips and boulders, and you're doing a lot of clambering. You want to make sure that one, you've always got a path off the beach, and that path isn't suddenly going to fill up with water. So if you're say you're in this crevice was about 6 feet deep. I want to make sure that the water is, 20, 30, 40 feet past me, so that I'm not going to be surprised by a wave that comes in and hits me in the knees. So yeah, it depends on the beach structure, but if you're on a rocky, like, structure with all these crevices, you definitely want to be more wary of where the water is, than if your beach is flat with no blocks in your line of sight.
So talking about safety on the beach, how do I know what is safe to touch?
So here in the Pacific Northwest, this is just in the Pacific Northwest, most things are safe to touch for you. They won't hurt you, except maybe some of our pigmented jellies. So like our lion's mane jelly is a very dark jelly. Those have stinging cells that can hurt. I would say most of our anemones aren't going to cause any kind of problem unless you're really sensitive to so different touch things. But the bigger thing is making sure that you're not hurting the animal. So even if it won't hurt you, you want to make sure that you're being cognizant of how your touch might hurt the animal. So like with anemones, like these ones here, if you touch them, they will close up. If you touch them a lot, they might shoot water out of their body, but that water was in their body because they are trying not to dry out until the tide comes back in. And so if they shoot that water out of their body, they have a higher likelihood of drying up before the tide comes back in. So that could be potentially dangerous for the animal. So in general, just be mindful of anything that you might touch on accident. Most things, I would say jellies are definitely one you want to be careful with. Fish also, and then crabs, just by nature of pinchers, you want to be careful with. But it's more of just being respectful of the animals and cognizant of what damage you can do while exploring.
So talking about the animals and making sure that they're staying safe while we're also staying safe, what do I do with a sea star if I see it out of water? As like this picture shows, there's sea stars right there that are clearly out of water. Do we leave them? Do we move them back to water? What do we do with those?
So in general, sea stars, we don't want to move them because like these ones here, they're clinging to the rock. Sea stars have tube feet that help them stick to things and help them hold in place, whether that's against waves or whether that's against gravity in this case. If they are attached to a rock and they look relatively healthy like these ones, we definitely don't want to touch them. The water will come back in. They will be absolutely fine. Just like the fish that will tolerate being out of the water for an hour or two. They they plan for this. If we're anthropomorphizing, they plan for this. They know that the tide's going to come back. So there's no reason to move them. That being said, if there was a sea star that was upside down at the very top of the beach, up above where the water is going to come back in, that one, if it's not attached to anything, that one maybe you could bring back down. But generally, it's best not to move animals from where they are. Unless it's very clear that it's having issues, they know what they're doing.
They've adapted. This is their home.
Yeah,
We're just
this is their
visiting,
home.
right?
Exactly. We're visiting.
Well, we are officially out of time for today. Again, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your experiences and all of these great photos. And if anybody is interested in learning more about marine life in Puget Sound and touch animals in a safe environment, we are open, the Mass Center Aquarium, Saturdays from 10 to 2 for free. So stop on in, learn more about each of these animals and their adaptations and how to safely touch them, where to find them. But also, again, you can go out onto Redondo Beach and see some of these animals in the wild right off of our dock here. So if you have any questions, we are monitoring the chat box up on our YouTube channel here. If you have any more in-depth questions or want to pick Emily's brain, her contact information is up on our website at mast.highline.edu. And I know she would be more than happy to answer any and all of your questions about tide pooling.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone, tide pool responsibly. Have a good one.